Hey everyone and welcome back. Now in today's video we'll be discussing about the HTTP API in Consul. Now within Consul there are multiple interfaces in which we can go ahead and communicate. You have the GUI, you have the API, you also have the CLI. So till now we have been primarily using the GUI as well as the CLI. However, API is also one of the very important endpoints that we need to be aware of. So the main interface to Consul is basically the RESTful HTTP API, and for that all the API routes are prefixed with version 1. So let's assume that you want to get the information associated with the key value where the key is coarse. So you can send a request. So this is basically a HTTP method. In this case it is a get. Then the endpoint is v1 followed by kv followed by coarse. So when you send a request to the Consul will go ahead and send a response back. In this case, it is sending the response of HashiCorp Consul, which is nothing but the value associated with the key of course. Now, one of the question that comes is, since there are a lot of sub resources that we can create in Consul, there are nodes, you have key value and so many others. First is, how do we get the endpoint associated with all of them? And also, what is the method that needs to be used while requesting for a resource operation? So let's look into it. Now within the Consul API docs over here, you have an extensive set of documentation related to the HTTP API structure. So let's take few examples over here. So let's take an example of catalog over here. So here it basically shows that the endpoint is catalog. It also gives you a description and what are the things that it allows us to do. So let's go a bit down, and here you have a option of list nodes. So if you look into the description, this endpoint returns the node registered in a given data center. So it shows you the method that needs to be used. It shows you the exact path that also needs to be used. And also one of the interesting thing is it also gives you the exact curl request that you can try it out. However, if you want to quickly test it, you can directly do it from the browser instead of doing a curl request. So for example, this is the UI page. Let's go ahead and modify it, as we already know that the API routes are prefixed with version 1. So let's change it to version 1 followed by the path, which is catalog/nodes. So let's say catalogs/nodes. So when you run this command, you basically get the output over here. In fact, let me maximize the screen so that this is much more viewable. So this basically shows you the IP address that is part of the data center. So in this case, it is matching the IP address since this is only one server that is running. Now, along with that, you can also make it a much more better output with the help of pretty. So now you see it has formatted and it is much more easier for us to read. So depending upon what operations you intend to do, you can go ahead and under the API documentation, you can look into the available resources. So second is, let's look into the key value store. So under the key value store endpoint, you have an option to read a specific key. So here, if you look into the command is curl followed by version 1 kv followed by the name of key, which is my-key. So let's also try it out. So before we do that, let's quickly open up the UI. Let's go to key value. Let's create a key call as course and the value of HashiCorp Consul. Let's go ahead and save it. Now let's look into this endpoint here. So it is v1 kv followed by the name of the key. In this case, the name of the key is course. So this time let's try it via the curl. So I'll say curl http 127.0.0.1 followed by port of 8500 version kv followed by the name of the key, which is course. It is giving you the value. So this is nothing but the base encoded value here. And if you do a pretty, you see you are getting a proper formatted output here. So along with viewing the data, you can also do a lot of other operations. Let's go a bit down. So you can go ahead and create or update a key. You can go ahead and also delete a key. So let's try the deleting part. So here the method is delete. The path is kv followed by the name of the key. So as expected, there is also a sample request that they have specified. So here you see you're specifying a request. So the request type is delete, and then you have to specify the exact path. So let's run the above command. Let's modify it with the request of delete. So I say request of delete, and you got the appropriate output back. Now if you go to the key value console, let's refresh the page and you see the appropriate key was deleted. So I hope you got the basic understanding on what the HTTP API is. Now some of the things can only be done via the HTTP API exclusively, and this is one of the reasons why it is important for you to be able to understand what exactly are the operations that you can do with the help of the appropriate method and the path that are being specified within the HTTP API documentation. So let's look into some of the important pointers. First one is that depending upon the resource on which the operation needs to be performed, the endpoint also changes accordingly. So this endpoint is not the V1 here that we were discussing. So these are basically the prefix, but the endpoint is something like the KV. So this can be considered as an appropriate endpoint. Second is the API documentation provides extensive information about the same that we have already looked into. Also, by default, the output of the HTTP API request is minimized JSON. However, if a client passes the pretty on the query string, the JSON would be formatted accordingly. So along with that, so for today's video, we did not really have any ACLs that were enabled for authentication. However, if you have ACLs that are enabled, then you will also have to pass a Consul token via the X Consul token header. So here you see you have to explicitly specify a header with X Consul token, and you can specify a token here, or you can also specify a header of authorization where you can go ahead and add a token here. Apart from that, everything else remains to be the same. Great. So that's the high level overview about the HTTP API.